Chapter 5. Three Little Girls from Tamani. This morning I'm preparing tea in the kitchen for my friend Farida, who has come down from the sixth floor to talk to me. She thinks I'm too passive, that I'm not taking care of myself. My fever is gone, my lungs are better, and for some time now Farida has been nagging me to snap out of my depression and apathy. She always has some good excuse to come give me a pep talk and cheer me up. She goes outside occasionally, whereas I'm still dragging myself aimlessly around the apartment, dejected over Mama's illness and Soraya's sadness. We open the kitchen window to let in a little air, and through the grating I look out to the mosque, as I often do. They finished their construction work there, perhaps with funds from that Osama bin Laden I wrote about for my exam. The mosque has become the domain of the Taliban, where they teach their version of the Quran. I can see the mullah in the center of the courtyard, surrounded by little boys, endlessly reciting under his supervision. He's holding a stick, this mullah, probably to strike any child who hesitates or makes a mistake. Farida watches him too. Maybe he's making them recite dreadful things. Look at that poor boy. He's smacking his hands. It's at this precise moment, watching them out of the window, that something clicks in my brain. First of all, of course, there are no girls, only boys, in that Quranic school, and these children can only learn one thing from the mullah, the text of the Quran. Religious education is important. It has always been in one of my courses, but I have been taught a wealth of other things as well: history, geography, Persian literature, mathematics, science. Who's going to teach the children all that now? There are still schools for boys. They aren't compulsory, so although some parents must think that a minimum of education is better than nothing. But what kind of education is this? Taliban propaganda sneaks in there so quickly. During their first 3 years of school, boys have to wear little hats and what looks like pajamas. They're 8 or 9 years old when they begin to wearing the white turban, which is way too big for them. Lots of boys in the neighborhood don't go to school anymore because their parents don't want them indoctrinated by the Taliban. Other children, whose mothers are widows, get absolutely no education because they're out in the street begging or selling anything at all to help their mothers. For these women outside the system, their sons are their only means of survival. Compared to all these children, I've been very lucky after all. My own education wasn't interrupted until the Taliban arrived. I attended primary school when I was 5 during the Soviet occupation. I was 9 when the civil war began between the Mujahideen and the communist regime began, and 12 when it ended. But it did not seriously disrupt my studies, and under the Islamic State government established by the resistance, I finished high school and began taking the entrance exams for the journalism department at the university. Now I'm 18, and for 2 years I've been living shut up within these walls, doing nothing, when I could perhaps make myself useful by joining those who are passing on their knowledge, even though I consider my learning somewhat skimpy. This morning, Farida agrees with me. Maybe she's been thinking the same thing for a while now. Listen, Latifa, it is over for you and me at this point. We'll never go any further with our education, but we could do something for those children. They should have at least some idea how to evaluate what the mullah is telling them. An underground school? Like Fawaza had? One of our former teachers was recently caught by the Taliban right in the middle of class. First they beat the children, then they attacked her, throwing her so violently down the stairs of her building that they broke one of her legs. Then they dragged her off by the hair, threw her in prison, and forced her to sign a statement saying that she would never disobey the Taliban law again. They threatened to stone her entire family in public if she didn't confess her error. I admire that woman immensely. She taught us so much when I was a student. When she created her secret school, Mrs. Fazia knew what she was doing and the risk she was taking. The children never arrived at the same hour to take her classes and never left at all at the same time. They kept their books at her home so that nothing illegal, according to the decrees of the Taliban, would be seen outside. She must have been denounced and exposed by a neighbor or a street beggar. These last are always sniffing around for something with which they could hope to curry favor with the authorities in Kabul. It is such a shame. because Mrs. Fawiza was so careful. At the beginning of every class, she would tell the children, keep a copy of a surah from the Quran next to you on the table. If anyone enters the room, you must say that we're busy studying it, and that's the only thing we're working on. The mosque and those little boys reciting as they rock back and forth, hypnotized or terrorized by the mullah, that's the jolt I needed this morning to spring into action. Sometimes things happen like that. It's just fate. Farida suggests that I replace Mrs. Fawiza, continue her work. Our former teacher would thus have her little revenge, knowing that someone was picking up where she was forced to leave off. So Farida and I talked seriously about setting up our school according to the principles of our predecessor. She needs to give us a course program and tell us what she's already covered. We should take the students only from our sector of apartment buildings, from families we know well, whom we can trust. We'll have to ask our girlfriends to help us. Mariam, for example, I'm sure she'd jump at the chance. Each of us will hold classes in her own apartment. Spreading things out will help keep what we're doing a secret. Finally, I have work to do. We write a short note to Mrs. Fariza and send it through her discreet channels, because it's safer not to go see her at her home or to ask her to come here. In any case, the unfortunate woman has not recovered from her injuries and has trouble getting around. She quickly sends word to us that she accepts our offer with joy, adding that not only will she give us her lesson programs, she will also come help us out from time to time. Considering what she's already suffered, we think she's extraordinarily courageous. Feeling confident, I tell my father and Dowd about our plan. Farida does the same with her father and Saber. We cannot succeed without approval from our families, who must agree to receive these pupils illegally in their homes. Everyone supports us, but Dowd has a word of warning. It is great that Mrs. Fawiza is giving you her lesson plans, but if she risks arousing suspicion by coming here, then you're taking a grave responsibility for her life. If the Taliban catch her a second time, she's done for, finished. You haven't the right to do that to her. Our two families then agree that Mrs. Fawiza should not come here to help out. As soon as she can send us her lesson plans, however, we'll get our organization up and running. I take 8 children. Farida does the same. Marianne will have 5, on average, depending on what day it is. Our pupils will be between 5 and 14 years old, both boys and girls and boys. We're taking risks as well, of course, but we're careful to limit them. The children won't have far to walk to get here, since they'll be simply coming from the inside of the same building, which has 36 apartments, or from the immediate neighborhood. This proximity is vital for their safety. One of my girl cousins, who lives in Taimani, a neighborhood in Kabul, told my father that a story that affected us terribly and underscored the need for such precautions. In Taimani, there was a clandestine school for little girls, but they had to walk a half an hour to get there, which was tremendously dangerous for them. One day, the bodies of several of the girls, 7 or 8 years old, were discovered in a garbage dump. They had been kidnapped, raped, and strangled with their own clothing. I often think of the little girls of Tamani while we set up our own school, and in their memory, I'm determined to do my best to help our neighborhood children. In spite of her weakness, Mama feels energized and helps us out as well. I try to protect her as much as possible from the noise because the children come and go at different times, and the disturbance is tiring for her. But I think she appreciates our effort even more since she herself can't practice her own profession. Soraya has promised to correct the children's written work in the evening. Dowd takes care of obtaining basic materials such as pencils and notebooks, and each family gives us money to pay for these supplies. The only real problem is books. We can find them, but they're so expensive. 12,000 Afghanis for a simple textbook, an enormous sum given the inflation rampant in our country. So the pupils' parents buy one manual for each child according to their means. Marianne teaches mathematics. Farida and I handle reading, history, and composition. Another girlfriend specializes in English for the older students. After our morning classes, I study the street out the window. If I see anyone I don't recognize, or who seems suspicious, the children wait before leaving. Often they have lunch here. Then I let the biggest boys go first. After another check of the street, the girls go off together, along with one girl's younger brother. Oddly enough, I'm not frightened. I do my work calmly, and so do my friends. Our network is airtight. We know all the parents personally, and the children are motivated and perfectly aware of the secret they must keep, the purpose of our improvised school, and its importance to them in the intellectual desert of the Taliban regime. They don't carry anything on them when they leave the apartment. No books at all, not the smallest notebook, not even a pencil. I keep everything in my room, and they come to class empty-handed as well, as if they were simply walking from one building to another, all at different times. I begin working between 9 and 10 in the morning, depending on who has arrived, and classes stop at noon. I teach in my room religious studies, history, geography, Persian literature, and twice a week writing and dictation. I have 5 girls. Rakima is 14. She's the only one who wears a shadri. Karishma and Tabassum are 2 7-year-old twins. Malika is 6 and Zakaya 5. The 3 boys are younger. Shahib is 7. Shakeb and Faoud is about 5. Imitating the teachers in my childhood, I always began the same way. Did you do your studies at home? Whoever didn't do his or her exercises, sit to one side, and we'll see about that later. Now, today we're going to discuss the importance of water on Earth and in human life. What is water for? I can see myself back in class, listening to my teacher. Mama enrolled me in school in Makaroran 1 on the south bank of the Kabul River, and that's where I completed my primary education. My father would drop me off at 8, and Shakila picked me up at 11:30. In my class, there was a girl named Wahida. She was from Kandahar, a big city at the edge of the Registan Desert. And since she was older than the rest of us, the teacher made her the head of the class, an honor that should have been mine since I had the best grades. I envied her and thought she was too bossy. When Wahida announced that she was going back to Kandahar, she must have expected that I would be sad. But on the contrary, I remember telling her, "It's much better for you to go back there." I became the head of the class with proud satisfaction. Now that I think about it, it wasn't very nice at the time. Although primary school we wore traditional clothing, but when we began high school, we had to wear a uniform, a brown dress over white overalls. The Soviets had just constructed a modern building in Microryan that they had called the Friendship School. Within the next 6 months, they built 2 more. Since school was now compulsory, they had certain measures to encourage families to send their children to class. They granted an allowance of 1,500 Afghanis per pupil per month, and in the high schools they provided free blue dresses for the girls, free gray shirts for everyone. This system lasted only 6 months. We called it Imdad, or disco aid, because the disco style of the 80s was synonymous to us with the luxuries we received from the Soviets. When the Army withdrew in 1989, the Soviets left behind a certain number of advisors in the area, whom we immediately dubbed the ones who missed the last truck out. There were many Soviet instructors in our school during the occupation, but in 1989 there were only 2 left, one of whom was in my class. Farhad, a classmate who was very sure of himself, used to tease him regularly by throwing wads of paper at his head. "Why do you stay here when everyone else has left?" he'd call out. Since Farhad's father was an important member of the new faction in power, no one dared reprimand him. I thought he was rather rude. After a while, these 2 instructors must have left as well, although I don't think Farhad's paper wads had anything to do with it, but his hatred of the Soviets was understandable. In our neighborhood, many children had lost their fathers who had gone missing or died in prison during those years. My playmates, Fereshta, Yama, Aimon, and Babrak, and especially Anita, who made my heart bleed. Anita and I were in the same class 9 years in a row. I liked her a lot. She was a thin girl with white skin and chestnut hair, winsome and gay. When I learned she lost her father, I drew even closer to her. Under the Soviets, her father had been arrested and imprisoned, and had vanished without a trace. Her mother never managed to find out why he had been arrested or where he had been taken, probably to the Pali Sharkihi, like my brother Wahid. But unlike thousands of other men, Anita's father never came back. The only memento Anita has of him is a photo showing her as a little girl in his arms. Her mother cried when she showed it to me. Anita reacted differently to this loss. She lived on the surface of things, a dreamy soul who loved to take part in theatricals at school and sometimes sang for class. It was her way of surviving and hoping. She would often say to me, "He'll come back some day." Compared to her, I was blessed. My parents were alive, and I knew their whole story thanks to one of my aunts who never tired of telling it. They had married for love. When my mama was a student in medicine attending free courses given by German doctors at the Goethe Institute in Kabul, at the time she was doing her supervisory period as a nurse in Masterat Hospital, which was where my father met and fell in love with her. For 4 years she never noticed, while he was sending her poems and doing his best to be charming and attentive to this belle indifferente. She had simply noticed his kindness, and it was one of her fellow nurses who had opened her eyes. When Mama returned his love, those around her opposed the marriage, as did Papa's grandmother, who was afraid to bring into the family a woman who had a university education, who worked in a hospital, and who might not show enough respect to the old lady. Finally, Papa told my mother, "If they keep trying to prevent our marriage, well then, I'll kidnap you." So they won their case and had a lovely engagement. Papa took his fiancée to the movies, on walks, to restaurants. One of Mama's girlfriends, who worked for the police, once remarked to her, "Aliyah, you picked a man, a real one. The proof is that he's not afraid to take you to a restaurant." At the time, my aunt explained, a man did not take a respectable woman to restaurants. My parents were married in 1964, and my brothers and sisters and I are all proud to be children of a marriage like theirs. That's how our family history began, and in a way, it's a symbol of Afghanistan. Papa is Pashtun, Mama has Tajik, and they've stayed together just as our country has in the face of wars, genocidal ethnic strife. One morning in the middle of winter in 1999, one of my students passes on a request from his parents that I explain the war against the British. The parents often ask me to teach certain subjects. Given the boy's age, I have to keep my explanation simple. The British tried to invade our country, but Afghans don't like foreign invaders. So, even though the British had sophisticated weapons while our people only had sticks, they fought back courageously. They won and the British left, and they never came back again. The British didn't know anything about our way of life. I'll give you an example. They had observed the Afghans that would often take from their pockets and chew some dusty little balls that looked like tiny little clumps of dirt. The British were intrigued and wondered what they were for. What were they, Latifa? In the countryside, people gathered mulberries, dried them, grind them up, and make this powder into an edible paste that's very sweet and lasts a long time. It's called takan, and it gives new energy to men during battles. After their defeat by the Afghans, the British didn't carry off any precious takan. They took gold, jewelry, and many other ancient objects they admired, but since they couldn't manage to transport these treasures across the mountains, they hid them here and there along the path they took to go home. And some people say they still dream of coming back one day to get them. Another day, another question. My father says that King Habibullah Khan never did anything good for our country, unlike President Daoud. He wants to know what you think. We'll talk about that tomorrow. The question has taken me by surprise, afraid of bungling my answer because the names and dates are a little mixed up in my memory. I prefer to ask my family to explain that period of our history to me later this evening. So the next morning, well informed on the subject, I can tell my pupil that his father is right. King Habibullah Khan did not serve his country well. In his palace, he had 300 women for all his own pleasure. His son Amanullah Khan declared independence and drove the British from our soil. But President Daoud had other ambitions. He wanted to develop Afghanistan into a moderate state. For example, he envisions that we would be able to manufacture cars and all sorts of similar products. That's why he didn't want to be king, but president of a republic. Unfortunately, he did not have time to achieve his goals because the Soviets intervened. When I was in school, our history courses began with the Anglo-Afghan Wars. Then came the modern period that my parents lived through, with the reign of Muhammad Zahir Shah, followed by the government of his cousin Daoud. I remember that my history teacher in high school, who was explaining the 19th century Anglo-Afghan wars to us, tried to make a comparison and got so carried away that he made a curious slip of the tongue. The Soviets left Afghanistan in 1878, like the British in 1989. Oh, no, I mean, they left in the same way, retreating in defeat. I recall a particular winter of 1988, 1989. The Soviets were about to leave the country. Kabul was in the grip of the coldest temperatures in living memory. Food supplies were almost exhausted. The Mujahideen had surrounded and blockaded the capital, and we were running out of everything. My sister and I would line up separately in front of two different bakeries to buy 6 loaves of bread. It was the same with gas, because the electric towers had been destroyed by the resistance, so everyone was using gas riggings for cooking and coal for heat. Lines were going longer all over the city. It took half a day to at least to get the least little item. Some people started waiting in mid-afternoon and reached the head of the line around 7 o'clock. Others arrived at the stores well before dawn, sometimes at 3 in the morning, in the hope of getting their turn at 9. These hardships lasted for 4 months, and people actually dropped dead standing in line. When there wasn't any bread, the wealthier Kabulis ate cake, while we were supposedly in the midst of a revolution. I ate so much cake I got sick of it. The Soviet planes resupplying the city landed only at night, and the newspaper spoke of Kabul on the life support. With the rocket fire, the endless lines, the price of rice, sugar, and flour, people in the city were nervous wrecks. The slightest thing would set them off and start them fighting amongst themselves. Many seriously considered leaving Kabul. Some married their daughters to boys who lived in the West, planning to join their daughters later and lead the entire family into exile. Others tried to sell their possessions to finance an often secret trip abroad. Kabul had lost even the artificial joy it had known under the Soviets. Finally, in the spring of 1989, the radio announced that our reserve stocks had been replenished. There would be no more problems with provisions. Strangely enough, Kabulis knew almost nothing about what was happening out in the countryside. Television offered us lots of entertainment programs, as if to hypnotize us. Concerts, the Miss Kabul or Miss Afghanistan pageant, Indian films. Theaters were open. Radio stations poured out floods of music. Now and then we did notice that there seemed to be more people in the city streets, but we knew nothing about the families that had fled their homes and villages during the fighting between government troops and the resistant forces. The population of the capital was slowly swelling before our thoughtless eyes. We didn't want to face reality. Of course, the Mujahideen existed. Of course, we knew about the resistance. But I believe we were still hoping that the situation would resolve itself, the country would be reunited, and peace would return. Then came Jalalabad. During the summer of 1991, 2 years after the Soviet retreat, the Mujahideen began a great battle to take that city with the massive support of the Pakistani army. The Afghan army and the communist government mobilized the population. It was on that occasion that Dr. Najibullah gave his famous speech on Irania Square. The authorities aimed to defend Jalalabad against the Mujahideen onslaught, but above all to fight the Pakistani interference. Women were recruited to provide security in the capital. That was the first time I saw women in military uniform. They were everywhere, at intersections and on the main avenues. They worked at Kabul's grain storage and milling facilities, which stayed open around the clock to ensure adequate supplies of bread. They drove electric public buses. They worked in administration and banks. They sang on television. Girls in the Communist Youth League made rounds of the schools to collect donations for the army. This mobilization even inspired young amateur singers to give charity concerts for the glory of the armed forces. And so you saw kids imitating Madonna or Michael Jackson singing for the Afghan army. Still, I certainly knew about girls in my neighborhood who were upset because their fiancés were leaving for the front. The day before the Mujahideen arrived, at the end of April 1992, we were attending a marriage in the Hotel Kabul in the center of town, across from the main bank and not far from the presidential palace and the treasury. The festivities got underway around 4 o'clock. Girls and boys were dancing in Western dress, and we dined before the religious ceremony was scheduled to begin. Suddenly, a soldier rushed into the room and explained to the father of the bride that resistance units had entered the capital and that the wedding ceremony should be completed quickly. Since most of the women were in low-cut dresses, they hastily put on their husbands' suit jackets and everyone rushed home. 5 minutes later, it was all over. The young groom's older brother took my sisters and me straight to our apartment, where our parents were surprised to see us back so early. They hadn't expected us until after midnight. Shakila asked if the radio had announced anything, but there had been no news bulletins. The next morning, things still seemed normal, and we all behaved as usual. Around 11, Shakila came to get me at school, telling me the teacher that I was needed at home. There could be a war in Kabul, she explains to me on the way back, and I have to warn the others. I'll call Papa at the store. I heard her ask him to buy some provisions and come home as fast as possible. Then she called the airport to tell Soraya to come home too. Shakila was trying to stay calm, but every 5 minutes she would go out to the window to see if our parents were coming. An hour and a half later, everyone had returned. "Why all this hurry?" asked Papa. I was on my way to work at the newspaper as usual and started noticing the stores were closed and that people were constructing barricades out of sandbags. The armed men I saw were wearing turbans. Well, no one besides the military has a right to carry weapons inside the city. When our taxi got as far as the Electric Power and Water Ministry, not far from the festival square, a soldier waved at us to halt. I showed him my press pass and explained that I was going to the newspaper offices, but he told me that Gulbuddin Hekmatar's men were there and that I should turn around. When I asked him who was this Hekmatar was, the man in the traditional clothes, wearing a turban and beard, shouted, "We are the Hizb Islami of Hekmatar." And suddenly the taxi was surrounded by all men in turbans. So I told the driver to turn around immediately. The driver was maneuvering the car to get out of there when the soldier who stopped me signaled again. He wanted me to take along 2 young women who worked at the ministry. They told me that these bearded men had hit and humiliated them because they were wearing skirts and pantyhose, that the men had torn off their pantyhose and tied them around their necks, spitting in their faces and calling them communists. After we got across the bridge to get back to our neighborhood, everything was quiet. No one could believe that situation was so different only a few hundred yards away. That evening, we had supper around 7:30, and it wasn't long before fighting broke out in the city. Shakila rushed up to Saber's apartment on the 6th floor to find out where the battles were, and even though it was illegal to own binoculars at the time, Saber had a pair. He was in love with Victoria, a girl who lived in the building across the way, and somehow he'd gotten his hands on these binoculars so that he could watch his girlfriend from his balcony. Saber's mother worked in the janitorial staff at the presidential palace, and she told Shakila that bearded men had sent all the women there home that day, accusing them of being communists. So Hekmatar's men were already at the presidential palace. From the 6th floor, Shakila saw the glow of the combat in the front of the palace, in the area of Pol Mahmud Khan, as well as over by the hospital in the neighborhood of Shashderek, near the radio and television building. Yet the radio was broadcasting normally, except that no one was giving any news about the fighting. Shakila was still quite shaken and kept repeating, "You see, I was right. I was right." Soraya and I had piled some cushions in front of our bedroom window, and I thought about what the girls of the school had been saying lately. If the extremists get into Kabul, we won't be able to wear makeup anymore or Western clothes. Just wait. They'll even forbid us to ride bicycles. A few minutes later, the explosions came so close that the tenants in the 5th and 6th floors, who were most at risk from rockets, went downstairs to the basement. The fighting continued for more than 2 days without us receiving any information from the government. Finally, on the third day, Radio Kabul announced that the men of Hekmatar's faction had been driven out and their attempt to take over the city foiled. Commander Massoud and was now the master of Kabul, and his government, the Islamic State of Afghanistan, issued a declaration of its new constitution. I still remember the welcome words we heard that day. As of next Saturday, everyone, women in particular, must return to work. Both the girls' and the boys' schools will be reopened. My classmates were just as relieved as I was. Hekmatar frightened us so much that only politics we followed in those days. We were girls who wanted the freedom to learn and thus work, and was that this fanatic should be driven as far away as possible, up to the north or out into Pakistan. A week later, there was a television report on the crimes committed by the communists. Groups of prisoners were shown, executed en masse at Poli Sharki, hundreds of pairs of shoes lying scattered about, and mass graves. When the communists were in power, thousands of people accused of anti-communism had been arrested, executed, and thrown into common graves. There were rumors about Afghan political prisoners who had been sent to Siberia. A few months later, my friend Anita came to see me to say goodbye, happy and full of hope. She was leaving with her mother for the USSR to look for her father, and they sold their house to pay for the trip. I was just so sad to see them go off in search of a ghost. Anita eventually returned from the USSR. She never found her father. The atmosphere in Kabul was now rather bizarre. We were still free to move around, study, work, yet at the same time we had to endure the daily war that Hekmatar and his men forced upon us by besieging the city. In 1993, the fighting became horrific in its violence and intensity. Afghans don't go to school in the winter because it's too cold, and schools become refuges for displaced families. Neighborhoods in the south, west, and downtown area of the city were particularly hard hit. Kabulis were fleeing from the northern neighborhoods, while some were leaving for Jalalabad or Pakistan. It was a real ethnic war. Pashtuns were killing Hazaras. Hazaras were killing Tajiks. The man most responsible for this butchery was still Gulbuddin Hekmatar, who everyone knew was completely dependent on the Pakistani intelligence service. To spread terror in the city, mysterious gangs of boys poisoned food by injecting a toxic substance into fruits and vegetables. Some people became ill, and a certain number even died. The inhabitants of Kabul were so afraid that they no longer dared to buy fresh produce from street vendors. And after a few weeks, one of these gangs was arrested and shown on television, and the food scare subsided. Rockets fell absolutely any place. On some days, there were 300 of them, or even 1,000. Hospitals were full of the wounded. Medicines were in short supply. Doctors worked night and day. In January of 1994, in an alliance with the troops of General Dastam and the Hazara commander Mazari, Hekmatar's forces started a bloody campaign. At 4 a.m. on January 1st, bombardments began that continued without let-up for 1 week. We spent in the basement with our neighbors. Electricity and running water were cut throughout the city. Then the combatants decided on a sort of truce that allowed foreign diplomats to leave the capital. We took advantage of the lull as well to take refuge in the northern sector of the city, and we saw that thousands of people, entire families, had been forced to abandon their homes. This battle lasted for more than 7 months, burning and blasting much of Kabul into rubble. The university, one of the largest in the region, burned. The university library, the second most important in Asia, pillaged and burned. The museum looted and destroyed. And in spite of everything, we went on living. I kept going to school, and Shakila got married on the day when 300 rockets fell on Kabul. Having lived through so much war, we had become indifferent to the tragedy of our country. so anesthetized that we were blind to the final threat that still lay in wait for us: a secret movement of religious students, a new militia that would take advantage of the tribal infighting over Kabul and seize a third of the country in the southwest at the end of 1994. We had little more than 2 years left to make the most of that strange freedom in a city under perpetual siege. I was 14, the same as little Ramika, who takes off her chaudhry as she enters my bedroom to sit quietly on the floor and listen to me read a poem by Mohammed Hafez Shahrazi. Sorry for about that. To me, the world was a house where I searched for knowledge everywhere. I loved to wander under many skies, gathering up each nuance of thought in diverse fruits that furnished the nourishment of my philosophy. Ramika will write it down at my dictation and recite it to me later on. She's of an age that allows the Taliban to enforce a monstrous decree announced as soon as they seize power: all girls must be married. Not long ago, I thought it was last year, a woman knocked on the door of an apartment in a building near ours. She was a decoy, a procuress who ferrets out young Afghan girls for the Taliban. Alone at home with her 3 daughters, the woman in the apartment opened the door, only to be rushed by some Talibs who beat her unconscious and kidnapped her daughters. The decoy claimed to the neighbors that the girls were already married to her sons and that she had the right to make her daughters-in-law live in her home. Since that episode, it's either my father or Dowd who opens the door to strangers. One of my girl cousins was caught in this diabolical trap. A Talib was so determined to have her, so threatening and tenacious, that she was obliged to marry another boy, much younger than she was, even though she still had stubbornly refused to get married until then. There are so many, many stories like that, shocking or simply deplorable stories of the shattered lives of girls my age or as young as Ramika. Tonight, I'm going to pray for the impossible, the return of freedom for women, and I'll be especially vigilant when I watch from the window as Ramika's chaudhry disappears down the street. I've changed. I've grown up.